Everybody, welcome back to our next go around with our ongoing exploration of all things church here in our adult class. If you've been following along, we've been doing various things like sometimes psalms, sometimes hymns, various focal points that our group has been working on. This time around, we are looking at the well known, wonderful praise and adoration hymn, How Great Thou Art. Now, if you are of the somewhat old school Lutheran variety and like to use the LBW or the Lutheran Book of Worship as we do, it is hymn number 532 there. If you are a little bit newer in the Lutheran tradition and use the red one, the ELW as we call it, it's number 856. But the original song that we know as How Great Thou Art is a Swedish hymn, and it's dating back quite a ways. About 140-ish odd years, to a guy named Karl Boberg, who was, of course, from Sweden, which is why it's a Swedish hymn. Now, the original hymn, or the original title in the Swedish, and rest assured, I do not speak Swedish, but I can, phonetically look at it, is O stor Gott, and it was written in the year 1885. So it's almost 100 years older than I am. Not quite, but real close. Now, the story goes, as I was able to find it, now don't quote me on this, but this is what I was able to find in my research, is that Boberg witnessed the power of a thunderstorm that came and went very quickly as he was walking home from church one day. And that, along with then witnessing various aspects of nature, various scenes, sights, and sounds, that inspired the original lyrics, which he wrote, and it's longer than we know it. We know it to be about 4 verses. He wrote originally 8 verses, or stanzas, sometimes it is called. The original song was set to an older Swedish folk tune that I don't know the name of, and it appeared in a Swedish hymnal called Sion's Harpen in the year 1890, so a few years after he wrote it. And what's interesting is Boberg was also a publisher, actually an editor, and he also published it in what I assume to be something like a magazine, although I'm not quite sure what it was, a publication called The Witness to the Truth. That's the English version of Senigsviknet, which I probably just slaughtered. But he was the editor, and he published his hymn in that. Now, the word or the title, O Stort Good, means O Great God. That's the literal translation. There was a Swedish and English version that was published here in the United States in the year 1914, so about 30-ish years after it was originally written. And it included both versions. It had the Swedish version as well as the English version. Now, I kind of looked up some of it, and I found that English translation, and you can definitely hear some of the influences of the original, or at least the original translation, if we want to say that, compared with the way that we know the hymn now. So if you're familiar with the hymn, kind of think about the first verse, and you can kind of hear some of the similarities, but there are definite differences. So this original version that came out in 1914 was, O great God, when I behold that world that you have created with your omnipotent word, how your wisdom guides the threads of life, and all beings are fed at your table. Then my soul bursts forth into praise, O great God, O great God. So that's kind of the original English, at least the oldest English version that I was able to find. Now, speaking of the English version that we know, that's present here, was published, or the one that's published in the LBW, was written by a guy named Stuart Hine back in 1949, so 75-ish years ago. Before that, there was a series of ongoing progression of translations from different languages that were actually interpretations that continued up into the 1970s. So there's been a long progression of various translations and and interpretations. And that's an important note, because while I believe that all interpretations or all translations are interpretations, sometimes you can reinterpret something more than just kind of a direct translation. Direct translation is always tricky in that regard, but we definitely see some of that. Now, the version that we have, that we know, it is in itself a progression of various translations. The German version of the original Swedish was then translated into Russian, and then Heim heard it in Russian and actually apparently knew Russian because he was a missionary. And then he paraphrased the Russian and then eventually moved that into English as well. In addition to the 4 verses that we have, he also wrote a few other verses. Of course, then since his death as well, as I kind of already mentioned, it's also kind of, there's been different versions that have come up, but that's the one that we are perhaps the most familiar with. So that's kind of a look into the history of the song, which is interesting. Now I want to kind of think about the theme within the lyrics. Now I'm not going to completely unpack these. These are just kind of some thoughts, kind of shooting from the hip just a little bit on what I'm thinking about in terms of the various themes. Now within the 4 verses that we have, I think there's 3 different themes that kind of emerge. Verses 1 and 2 kind of share a theme, though from some slightly different perspectives. I believe they focus in on the wonder that we witness within God's creation, and we could perhaps make an argument of a connection between the 2 accounts of creation that we have in Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2. Now within verse 1 has kind of a cosmic nature as we hear about the worlds that God has made and the stars and the thunder and the universe, all those things, which to me reminds me a lot of the general theme of the first account of creation, which in my opinion is very cosmic in nature. Then if we move into verse 2, we kind of take more of a nature view and almost like the author witnessing these things. When we hear about the woods and the forests and the birds singing and looking down from the mountains and the sound of the brooks and the breeze. So that to me is kind of reminiscent a little bit of the second account of creation, which again, in my opinion, is really aimed at the human perspective. So we've got kind of those 2 same ideas from different perspectives that I think fill that first theme. Now, when we move into verse 3, we have a reference to the Christ event, aka Jesus coming into the world, living, dying, rising again, and dying on the cross to overcome sin. It's kind of very gospel-centric in the past tense, as in looking back at the gospel, the Christ event as we know it, as we look at the Bible. Then if we move into verse 4, it's kind of the forward-looking look, the back end of the gospel, if we want to say it that, the hope of witnessing the future promise of the second coming of Christ kind of seems to be the theme within that 4th verse. Now, of course, we also have the refrain that happens with every verse, and it sticks with the general theme of praise and adoration. In fact, if I look at the theme, our hymnal has in the corner basically the general theme of that hymn. Praise and adoration is what it's called. And it's the praise and adoration within the author at all that God has done and all that God has promised, and how it is revealing the greatness of God. And the author feels it even within themselves, within their soul. Their very soul cries out, "How great thou art." Those are some themes, some ideas, some history that lies behind this hymn. I hope that you have a great discussion, and I will leave you to it.